It's all yours.
There we go. Sorry.
Or you could just use the arrow.
All right. There we go. Well, good afternoon, all. Hugo Gaggioni and myself are going to give you relief from all of that IP stuff that you've been immersed in. We'll throw as much analog in here as possible. When Hugo and I learned that we're both going to speak on the same topic of HDR, we had a little chat and we sort of divvied it up so we wouldn't tread on each other's toes. So hopefully he hasn't seen my presentation, I haven't seen his, but I think we sort of separated and come at it from a couple of directions. This is what I will talk about. I'll spend a quick one on the human visual system. And then I'd like to talk about the implications of originating HDR, the lens camera issues. And then I'll speak to the Dolby system, and I chose that because it's one of the best known of the various proponent systems. Hugo will be speaking about the other alternative that I'll leave it all to him. And then if I have time, I'll do a quick few words about what you can do today with tools on set when you're actually shooting HDR. So, jumping in, just a little terminology. When you light a scene with the sun or in studio, you're pouring illuminance down. Illuminance comes down onto the set, onto the scene, measured in lux. And then the sort of scene illuminations that we have in the real world, if you look straight at the sun, you're looking at 1.6 billion lux, so I don't think you do that too much. But you can see it's just an enormous range of illumination in our real world, and we can see in all of those environments. Now, an introduction to this peculiar little word, nits. When you look at a scene, I'm looking out at you, it's luminance coming back to me. When I look at this screen, it's luminance coming back. Illuminance going down, luminance coming to me. And that's what we're very interested in. And luminance is measured in candelas per square meter, and that has been now affectionately turned into nits. There's probably some history there I won't go into. But this, courtesy of Dolby, just gives you a sense of some real-world nits. If you get a reflection off a car, you can be up in the hundreds of thousands of nits. If you're in a darkened doorway, you can be in fractions of a nit. So it's an enormous range. Now, a little bit about our human visual system. Looking now at scene luminance, that which we look at when we're looking at scenes, that's the scale. And on the left is our human visual system. There are three mechanisms. You probably know it all. Lots of learned papers if you go on Google about all of this. The photopics is where you're out and bright and you can see full color. And then the scotopic is at night, you don't see much color. And then the in-between, the twilight world of mesopic. But between them all, we can range over a huge range. But our steady state, or the simultaneous dynamic range, is typically, the latest thinking is about 12.5 stops, 6,000 to 1. In other words, when you're in a given environment. Now, there's a temporal aspect to that. I'm not going to go into all of that, but roughly about 12.5 stops in a given environment. So if I am in indoor lighting, it might be like that. If I go out into the dark, moonlight, we will ultimately slide down. It takes time to adapt, but you will get pretty well that full dynamic range again. And if I go out into bright sunshine, you go up. But again, you have that finite dynamic range. So that's important because that became one of the yardsticks when the exploration of dynamic range in a video system surfaced some years ago. Now, the limitations of the television system, up to about a decade ago, you were talking about 1,000 to 1. The CRTs, sort of around the 100, perhaps 150 nits for the white, and 0.1 for black. A CRT well adjusted by a skilled person could go down further. CRTs were pretty good in the blacks, better than the initial LCDs that came out, but typically we were looking at 1,000 to 1. So we were shortchanging, if you will, viewing at home, shortchanging the capability of our human visual system by about 6 to 1. And that was sort of the beginning of the thinking, can we do better? Well, it all started about a decade ago when display technologies moved in a number of directions. We had plasmas, we had LCDs, we had backlit LCDs, quantum dots. You've heard of all of the technologies. So things were moving, and suddenly we were beginning to see much greater capabilities in hundreds of nits, and also everybody trying to get the blacks. There was a big quest in the early LCDs to do something about their blacks. So that's what the march was. The consumer displays were moving in both directions. And that triggered a discussion. And in 2012, Dolby stunned the world when they wrote this piece in their submission to the ITU, who were working on the UHD standardization. And they said, now guys, it's all very well to talk about 4K and 8K, but you gotta crank in dynamic range into these future standards. And they came up with these numbers, and I think Hugo and I picked ourselves off the floor at the time. We scoffed at it. 10,000 nits, are you joking? Well, today we're seeing 1,000 nits, we're seeing 2,000 nits, we even see a couple of 4,000 nits. The march is on. And what Dolby said was, look long term. We can't anticipate all that's going to happen in displays. Let's write a blueprint. Let's write a standard that will last probably for as long as televisions or video is around. So this is what Dolby said, basically. And you can see their proposal is greater than the steady-state human visual system. All right, so that's background on HDR, very quickly where it came from, a little bit of the terminology. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the implications of this on the lens camera front. I put this up just as a kickoff, simple block diagram describing the television as we've known it right up to today, scene to screen. And the stake in the ground, if you will, has always been that up to electronic transfer function in the camera, the OETF, and that transcribes optics, is transcribed to electronics, and electronics then we put a curve in there to protect our data, which was analog at one time, now it's digital, and we call that scene-referred image data. That's very important when I get down the road a little bit and talk about Dolby's proposal. Now, to put context, I'm putting a couple of images up there I just snatched off the screen to make the point that dynamic range is all about going up and, very importantly, going down into deep shadows. If I am in a dark cathedral, and they usually are pretty dim inside, but I look up, I see this beautiful stained glass windows, and I want to expose that to give you the full richness of the stained glass. And by the way, stained glass is a wider color gamut than most things in the real world. I would lose, with the typical television system, all these folks would be submerged down in the dark, and you wouldn't see the colors of their clothing, etc. But that's what we want to do, is give you both. We want to let you see down there with great detail and properly expose that stained glass window. We'd like to be able to look at the colors of these two ladies sitting on the bench there in a sort of darkish scene like that. And then you see scenes like this in television all the time. Dark, moody scenes. The producers and the directors and the DPs, the cinematographers, they love dark, moody scenes, as does movies. So again, detail. Now that one, if you saw the original picture, the gentleman is wearing a robe with great detail in it. It's lost here mostly through printing, not so much television. But the issue is, how do I give you those highlights and not cut them off, and how do I give you the detail in his robes? So there's great interest in the going down, and I'll be talking about that quite a bit. This was typical of dynamic range of an image sensor, CCD, during the first decade or two of high-definition television, about 10 stops of dynamic range. And the camera manufacturers would decide the mapping point. That was an individual decision by each camera manufacturer, because they knew their noise floor of their sensor. They wanted to give you a dynamic range that they felt is a good dynamic range, but also give you whatever they can in terms of a couple of stops above white to handle the overexposed signals. And we saw a lot of work going on with the famous Rec 709 Gamut, the one that was standardized by SMPTE and the ITU. But then the camera manufacturers started to put in knee and slope and things like that to try and stretch and grab a little more of the highlights of the clouds and the sun. And today we're talking about, and I'm showing you one of our contemporary image sensors here, we're talking about 15 stops of dynamic range. And in ours, if we map it for television, we've got a noise floor of 68 dB, so you got a 68 dB dynamic range, and we're giving you 4 stops of overhead, 1600% above reference white. That's quite a dynamic range, 15 stops. Very contemporary. You'll find most of the high-end cameras from Sony, Arri, etc. We're all around the 14, 15 stops today, relatively recently. And with this movement, when digital cinema started to really get active a decade ago, and we were then trying to pursue motion picture film, negative, which always had a great dynamic range, and that's really what started the march to try and get video to catch up with motion picture film. Logarithmic transfer functions came in, where we said, we're not going to worry too much about lowering the white, the reference white. Signal to noise in these cameras are so good, don't worry about that. Go all out to get as many stops above and down as possible in the cameras. So today, there are many logs. All of the major camera manufacturers has their own label because each of those log curves is different to the other. Why? Well, because we individually know our own image sensor, all of its strengths and all of its idiosyncrasies. We know what its noise floor is. We also know some other naughty things that go on way down in the noise related to readout in image sensors and that. And we try to shape a curve, our optoelectronic log curve, to maximize the extraction of signal from our image sensor. And Sony would do theirs with theirs, and Arri does it with theirs. And the sensors are different. Some go higher than others, some go deeper than others. So that probably will never be unified. There is a work going on in SMPTE today to come up with a norm that you can put into all cameras, sort of like a 709. That work is going on as we speak, but it will be a conversion most likely. All of us will stay loyal to our own log curves. We're very, very jealous about that. Now here's some numbers here that are very important to convey to you the challenge for the camera. I'm saying 15 stops, and I'm saying this image sensor that I showed you, 1600%, reference white, 700 millivolts. Now, as I stop down, each stop is, you divide by 2, go down all the way to 15 stops, you end up with a signal level of 0.05 IRE in 700 millivolt reference white IRE, or 0.34 millivolt. And a lot of people in the early discussions of all this, they said, what the heck are you doing down there? Nobody works down there. Well, they do. They do work down there. And I'm going to show you a little bit about those last 4 steps to convey to you what we're trying to do in today's cameras. So there's my last 4 steps, each one divided by 2. And I said we had a 68 dB signal to noise. So that's 68 luma, 68 dB reference to 700 millivolts. That calculates out to 0.28 RMS, volts RMS, relative to the 700 millivolts. So if I add that level of noise to those steps, you can see that on the last step that we decided would be our last step, and here's the reason why, that noise is essentially the amplitude of the last bit of signal. So the signal to noise down there is 0 dB. That's when we at Canon, we call it quits there. Some people go a little further. They say, and you might say, but this is ridiculous. Who deals with noise like that? Well, I show you this. That there is 0 dB. That grayscale there can very easily be extracted in contemporary grading tools that we have today in post-production houses. No problem. And they want to. They want that black detail down there. They'll go and spend some trouble. If I give them 15 stops and most of it's down there, they'll go to the trouble if they're doing an episodic or a drama or a movie. Television, live television, news magazine shows, etc. No, you won't bother with that sort of signal. You don't want to be spending a lot of time grading. So we have to put those 2 demands into our camera, recognize that both exist. So our logarithmic curve is this one here, and it's a very aggressive curve. There's our 1600%. So this is what this sensor is capable of doing. We give you a couple more stops up there because we're anticipating some improvements in our sensors in the next 2-3 years. And also we give the post-production folks a little room to slide up and down as they push and pull, as they call it, when they're grading. But you can see that here, when you try to look at, say, reference white is somewhere in here, it's very difficult to extract anything from that. And for that reason, we sort of walked away from the traditional curve as we know it. And we talk about log-log curves. And you'll see why in a moment. And we talk about, rather than fussing about this reference white, we see a lot of value to what the cinematographers have been doing forever with film. And that's their reference point is 18% gray. And so the mid-gray, and now the input, the scene luminance, logarithmic, and then the log curve, now it becomes linear. And it would be linear if there was no noise down there and we could keep going down. But at some point, this curve starts to bottom out for all of us image sensor designers. And this, of course, varies between the image sensors. Some people go further down. Some people don't quite go that far. But now you can see things a little more clearly. If I map that image sensor I showed you a little while ago on gray, now I've got more than 6 stops above the gray and more than 8 stops below the gray. That's a very nice dynamic range, very welcome. Now, when we plot that on that log-log scale, the green curve there is the one I had shown you earlier. That's what we call Canon log 2. This red one we put in, and that's the one that's in there for folks who do not want to fuss with the last couple of steps down there and all that noise. They just want to get a very decent dynamic range, 13 stops perhaps, and minimum grading, and just get a great picture. So you have a choice. And if you use the Canon log 2, it will let you capture that. It sits right about there is your bottoming out at that 9 stop. You're in here. If you don't want that, you go to the Canon log 3, and now you bottom out here, and these last couple of steps in here are just clipped off. You don't see them. So that's our approach. There are variations on this theme between the different camera manufacturers. All right, so that gives you a sense of where we are in the challenge in cameras, and it's quite remarkable what most of the majors are doing today. Lenses, a lot of people scratch their head and say, what's HDR? Isn't HDR electronic? No, it's the first footprint on your image is always the lens, and it puts a footprint on all of the quality factors, sharpness, color, dynamic range, etc. So I'm showing here a scenario of the scene luminance transmitting through the lens onto the image sensor. The camera designer decides on where to put reference white, defines a dynamic range for the most prominent, most valuable part of the imagery is always down here. And then this is for your highlights, your speculars, etc. Now, here in the lens, if the camera guy has a noise floor that's very decent, and they are today, they're around the 60 dB, then our optical noise floor better be below that. Now, what's an optical noise floor? Well, you heard Mark Shubin refer today in his talk about that studio lens with the 36 elements and all the light splashing, the reflections, the light that's lost as you transmit through the lens. That light is splashing back, and it's polluting the black reproduction. And that's why we put very expensive and very exotic optical coatings on each and every surface. And when he talked about 99.8% transmission through a lens that normally had 92, it's because of these optical coatings. So it's helping us remove artifacts, and it's helping us reproduce a deep, deep black, which is essential to capitalize on and give the camera guy full capability of what their imager can do. Then the next one is speculars. Sorry. Now, if I image a scene like this, lots of speculars, some pretty high speculars here, but I also want to reproduce, show you the logs in the fireplace. So again, I want to go down and I want to treat those speculars. Now, lenses can do funny things to speculars that go way up. They can do very funny things. They can chop them off. They can distort them. The aberrations can get worse as you go up. So we have to be very attentive to that as we deal with this area here. And that's part of the science of doing lenses for HDR. Then you come up with the severe situations, the highlight off the car coming in at 350,000 nits, or the sun suddenly comes into the scene and you can't really get it out, or there's a studio light or a light on a ball field, etc. These are the strong highlights. Now, some tests were conducted last year in the UK. They tested all of the cinematography lenses for HDR. One of their tests, this was just one of many, was they looked at speculars, but they also put a studio light right behind the lady here, blasting straight into the lens to see what does that do to that lovely lady's face. Well, you can see there that in that particular lens, it got a little milky. That's called veiling glare. That's part of the aberrations I talked about. There's a lens that was really naughty, and there's a lens that's pretty decent. But, you know, very, very severe tests. But it's the sort of thing people are looking at now as they explore HDR. Some of the strategies, as well as optical, we do a lot of optomechanical strategies, because one of the most troublesome places for reflections is the mounting, where the lens element is mounted. Funny things can happen down here, and light leaks, etc. So we rely on things like, we call them black paint, special paints, flocking, and serrations, anti-reflection processes. These are all part of the secret sauce of each of the lens manufacturers, and it all gets much more important with HDR. Okay, now there's another aspect. We all know that HDR and wide color gamut, man, you can see that across the room. You may not see 4K across the room, but you will see these two guys. They really enhance imagery. So you want to exploit that. But there's a dark side from the lens point of view to this HDR. HDR, as well as giving you more dynamic range, HDR also increases color volume. Now, if you've got a wide color gamut, those colors actually become that much more rich looking in an HDR scenario capture. But the problem with the lens is all lenses have aberrations. And the chromatic aberrations, there's lateral, which is misregistration. There's longitudinal, which is defocusing, causes a flare, colored flare. And these guys, if you have a scene which has highlights in it, like that, and I'm going to draw your attention to a highlight here, in SDR, in a good, say, HD lens today, a good lens, there's always chromatic aberrations. We can only get them so far down, but you typically won't see them. But if that's mounted on an HDR camera, you may start to see them. So aberrations is something we have to drive further down when we consider HDR lenses, and especially with UHD HDR lenses, because the UHD, the 4K, the sensor is able to see small amounts of artifacts that perhaps an HD sensor might not. So there are conspiracies here as we move up in resolution and dynamic range. So lens design is all about maximizing the sharpness, minimizing the chromatic aberrations, and then shaping your spectral characteristic and the dynamic range that I talked about, trying to optimize all of those. And the difference between 4K lenses and HD lenses is that you've improved in every one of these respects. Good news about that, by the way, if you're not ready for 4K, but you got to buy a lens, it does make sense to buy a 4K lens today, because you get better HD in all respects. HDR, sharpness, minimize aberrations, something to think about. All right, now HDR is a television system. In its most simple form, if we're originating, and we are today, there's a lot of folks shooting HDR, and they're going to homes where HDR sets are beginning to appear, but the majority are still SDR. How do we service both? How do we give both great images? That's part of the system challenge of HDR. And the proponent systems that are out there today, Dolby being the one that kicked it off, the BBC, Hugo will talk a lot about this, Philips, Technicolor, these guys have come together on a system. And all of these systems have been, are and have been tested and will continue to be tested. The networks are doing a great deal of work. CBS has been doing a lot of testing of these on sports over the last 8 or 9 months. And that will continue. I'm going to talk just about this one here, just to give you a reference. And today, it is interesting, recognizing that we're looking at a transition at some point in the future to 4K. Nobody quite knows when, but it's sort of dangling out there. And we're seeing that we have HDR, and you're seeing that the cameras being offered now by all of the Grass Valleys, Sonys, Hitachis, everybody, and on the cinema side ourselves, they're all multi-format. They'd switch between the 4 production formats, and they're multi-purpose in the sense you can switch between different choices in dynamic range. In our camera, for example, Canon Log 2 is in there, Canon Log 3 is in there, and we can give you that on the output. But for those who want HLG or PQ, we also offer those. We make a derivation and send out a PQ and an HLG as a choice. And we also have switchable color gamuts. Sorry, that's our conversion to the PQ and the HLG. We have switchable color gamuts from the wide color gamut of the UHD to the digital cinema, and this is a special one we have for motion picture production where you can emulate film stocks. So all of the manufacturers are doing this today. Why? Because it's a very uncertain future we're looking into. When do you switch to 4K? Are you going to go 1080p with HDR, which was much talked about this year at NAB with all of the broadcasters and at the HPA Tech Retreat? So there's going to be transitions with different broadcasters and cable operators, etc., making different decisions. So the cameras are multi-purpose. You buy one today, you shoot HD. When you're ready to do 1080p, you just flick it to 1080p, pick a color gamut, pick an HDR, and you're there. And I think you'll see pretty well all cameras from now on being multi-purpose. All right, enough about the cameras. Now, a little bit about this Dolby system. You've heard it affectionately called PQ, perceptual quantization. I'll give it to you very rapidly. What they said, and this again was a bit of another shock, they said, okay, television has always been scene-referred system, like I showed you before, defined by the optoelectronic transfer in the camera. Dolby said, no, no, no. We're saying we're going to have a curve that's going to go from 0.001 all the way up to 10,000. And we're going to shape that curve perceptually, and I'll show you that in a moment, and we're going to assign code values to it at 10-bit level, 12-bit, whatever. And that's fixed. So they're saying our stake in the ground is the display, the final display, and certainly the mastering display in post-production. So let me just show you their thinking. Their stake in the ground is this guy. What they would like to see in all the cameras is a perfect inverse of that. But that is too hard on blacks. That curve at the black is just, no camera could, nobody has the sensor that could stand that. So we all do our own logs, and then we make conversions to the best we can for a PQ output, recognizing that today nobody's at 10,000 nits, so we're sort of mostly focused on 1,000 nits, perhaps 2,000 nits, which I think will be the norm for best part of a decade, I think. Now here's what it means. It means that if I have a display, a good HDR display today, about 500 nits, 500 or 600 nits, you can get them pretty reasonably priced, and it is going to conform to PQ. It means that they will use in their in that set the bottom part of that PQ curve. And they'll only be using, instead, 940 is the code. That's a 10-bit digital code from the camera. This is the camera OETF. And then that goes through the system, and it's applied here, and then that transfers it finally to the light output. I'll only be using code around 690 for a 500 nit. For a 1,000 nit, I'll be using a little more of that curve. And for, say, a 4,000 nit, I just arbitrarily pick that, I'll use more of the curve. And not until a 10,000 nit display comes along will I use that full curve. So that's the thinking of Dolby, that they want that curve nailed in the sets, tailored to the capability of that panel, be it from LG, Sony, Samsung, whoever. And this, by the way, is the Dolby Vision system. They have an end-to-end system. They could probably give you a couple of hours here on it. But the big important point was they can, at the front end, in all that intent rendering, as they call it, and all that's done in mastering, all of that is captured in metadata, and that's carried through the system all the way to the television set in the home, and it instructs that television set how best to be set up. And if the dynamic range is changing scene by scene, the Dolby system will allow dynamic changes. Now, that became a boiling discussion in the television industry, and that's when the BBC jumped up on their horse and they said, no, 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 we don't want metadata. And I'll let Hugo tell you that story. Now, the science behind PQ, this is important. What Dolby did, and to their credit, they did some very fine research. They knew this. This is a study that's gone on as long as television's been around, our contrast sensitivity function. At different levels of luminance, we are able to distinguish between two levels around that luminance level, slightly above and slightly below. And that varies, the distinction of that, our perception of that. The scientists kept making it smaller and smaller until you couldn't see it. But then they slide that up and down the full luminance scale, and it turns out to be quite nonlinear. Now, the importance of that is, of course, today with digital coding, the whole discussion of 8-bit, 10-bit, 12-bit. And Dolby said, we want to do this incredible 10,000 nits with 12 bits. We don't want to be going any higher than 12. So to do that, they recognized this, and they did a lot of very fine work looking at this and making all sorts of measurements, sliding up. And another gentleman who had done great work, and this was the basis for Dolby, was this famous curve. This is the curve that says stepping, or that little differential I talked about, or a digital contour step, is invisible below that curve and is visible above. So what they said, we want a curve in the display that is respectful of that. Now, the ITU finally specified an EOTF for displays in 2011, about 20 years too late, but it's the first time it's ever been standardized, and you can see that it's hopeless. At 1,000 nits, 12 bits, you're in real trouble up here. But what Dolby said was our curve, which is now an SMPTE standard, 2084, comes down there. And 10 bits lies very, very close. It kisses this curve. So even 10 bits does a very good job. In 12 bits, you just don't see contouring. And that was what defined the PQ curve of Dolby. Okay, let's see. I'm over. All right, let me do this real quick. You probably heard about this great work that went on mostly in Hollywood with some of the great folks in the world, the manufacturers and all of the DPs, directors, a huge body of work to look at how to take all sorts of sources, bring them into a space to do grading. And they could be sources from film, from Sony's camera, from my camera, from Ari's camera, but we can bring them into a space where they go back to linear. We'll take out those gamma curves, those log curves of each, and then we'll do grading in an enormous dynamic range space and an enormous color gamut. Then we go back out with appropriate transformations to possibly a mastering display and ultimately anticipating what the delivery systems might be. There'll be various versions made. We have a reference monitor which we built a proxy of that inside the monitor so that on set we can grade for HDR and to a degree for wide color gamut. We're limited on the color gamut by our panel cannot go out. No panel yet can go out to the 2020 color space. But this is what's inside. I don't have time to discuss it all. I just want to get the point across. Now, if our panel, our 24-inch, has 1,000 nit capability, this is a 4K display. But if somebody sends in a signal from some unknown camera and it's higher than that 1,000, now what do I do? Well, we put in a ranging system inside. It's a linear compression. So if somebody comes in with a very high dynamic range, we simply go in and pull that down. So we take that 2,000, 4,000, whatever it is, and nail it to the 1,000 of that, and then we grade those highlights. You might be grading the sky, the clouds, etc. Then you raise it back up again, and you work on the lower part of the signal. It works. It lets you take scenes like this where you're trying to recover that outdoors there, and you pull that down, and now you can grade that by using that linear compression. Anyway, that's one of the tools. The other tools, and this, by the way, is the grading controls on the monitor. And we also, in the display, give you a variety of menu-selected graticules. We can give you the traditional 709. If you want Canon Log 2, we'll give you that, scaled up to 1600%. If you want the SMPTE PQ, we'll give you that to a chosen level of nits that you may be dealing with. So you have waveform tools, you have that scaling tool, and then last but not least, we give you a false color metering. If you're shooting a live scene, you can, again, push a button and superimpose on that scene these colors, and it will tell you that that part there is going to be up around, you're entering the highlights, this is your digital code. We also give you a readout in the display of the nits of that level, the nits of that level, the nits of that. So a lot of tools to help you make creative choices. Very important on live when you don't have time to do another take. You're suddenly dealing with the deep shadows on the stadium and the bright sun coming in. To be able to put that metering on is very important. All right, so that just shows you some of the metering. We did this at NAB. And we also can, last but not least, the final thing, we can split screen. And as you grade the HDR on set, you can see the effect it's having on the SDR. Both of these then are stored in a thumb drive, and that's taken into post-production. And that's it. I'm sorry, I ran over by 5 minutes. Thank you.